as we continue on, we're going to focus in first on this section around identifying where the gaps exist. And as we do so, one of the things that we want to take a look at is really those year-over-year comparisons. We want to make sure that as we look at our documentation, I think it's important just to remind everybody that what CMS sees is really the documentation that counts. And so if we can't align ourselves with that information and make sure that we are being accurate in the capture of that information, then we do ourselves a disservice, as well as not necessarily then being paid properly for that. We can't necessarily deliver the care as appropriate. So we want to make sure that we get those documentation and coding gaps attended to. And that begins with just making sure that as we do a year-over-year comparison, we are matching for that data. We're identifying where those gaps are and making sure that we know which patients are associated with that, of course, and then also the providers, so that we can begin to focus our attention on closing those gaps, addressing those gaps as is appropriate. And I think it's also important to mention that while we're looking backward and doing a year-over-year comparison, we also want to be looking forward and making sure as we identify those opportunities that we're keeping those top of mind and making sure that individuals in our networks and our provider groups actually are seeing and hearing from us on where those gaps persist, and making sure that we're working with them to try to close those out. And then finally, a tool that we think is particularly useful is actually doing a benchmark comparison. So, of course, looking at the individual records, determining that at the level of the provider and the individual is key. But if you can also get a quick snapshot of how you're doing against benchmark performance, that's going to help you really target those areas that you want to focus in on. And as we look at the various types of quality measures, certainly our HEDIS, P for P, and STARS are critical for all. And looking at this and just understanding that not only at the group level, but at the individual provider level, whether or not we're dealing with documentation challenges, educational challenges, compliance challenges, any and all of those things need to be looked at, and we need to be working in partnership with those individuals to try to get those to closure. We think that really trying to understand the best practices as it relates to outreach and engagement, and how do we educate those organizations on how to do that and to how good success in the doing of that, I think is also an important lever to consider. So let's talk just a moment about what we're the meat and potatoes here, actually, of what this all means. If we are finding an individual record and we just take it at first glance, what we often will see is that there's not a lot of detail in some of these documentation sets, and we want to make sure that we're finding out where those gaps are. And so here's just a simple example of what it would look like, where we have a 68-year-old male who does not have the proper HCC diagnosis documentation, and certainly then that reflects in the RAS score and ultimately in the payment for that individual's care. As we consider just getting to sort of basic HCC coding, just making sure we have capture of those key conditions, then we can see an improvement in that, of course. We're going to see that RAF score go up. We're going to see the attendant improvement in the payment. But what's really critical is getting to a level of precision and accuracy here, making sure that you have a comprehensive set of documentation here that actually truly reflects the state of the individual, as well as the proper code assigned to that, so that you are really taking full advantage of the appropriate scoring, and again, noting that the risk score is adjusting here, as well as payment. So the delta between that no HCC diagnosis to an accurate and comprehensive HCC coding approach is really clearly very substantial. And in this instance, $9,500 or so is the delta. So that's going to add up to really significant dollars and cents in an organization, and we want to make sure that we're going after that as quickly and as efficiently as we can. So getting into a little bit more detail of how to do that, you want to be able to look at this across the various groups in an organization. You want to be able to identify those groups, find those PCPs or those particular physicians within that group that have associated members where we're finding challenges with some of the coding capture, and being able to look at that in terms of the prior payment year and understanding what's missing, and then calculating that in terms of the potential revenue miss that's teeing up as a result of that. So again, just making sure that we're looking at what data should we expect to see, do we see it, if we don't see it, giving some quantification to that so people can really understand the material effect here that lack of documentation really can create. And as we look at that, we want also to really begin to delve a little bit more fully into each of the providers and begin to understand where they may be located. So there may be new patterns that are appearing to us. So we're finding out this information. We're understanding that we have some gaps perhaps and maybe need to do some education and training. So we want to go ahead and take a look at that and having sometimes a geographic representation to just help us correlate. Do we have problems in the same areas? Again, this just helps us understand more fully where I need to be spending my time and attention. And really, if I've got organizations like Facility West here, which has the greatest concentration of providers and patients, we see the highest population risk, that's my highest opportunity for coding recapture and making sure my documentation situation is in order. So if I've only got a limited number of resources, as the reality in most organizations today, then this helps me get a better handle on where do I want to focus my time and attention so I can actually begin to help that practice do a better job and in turn benefit the member and the beneficiary, and in so doing also generate the revenue we need to reinvest in new programs. As we look across this set of data, then we start to also understand that maybe there's some additional program need here. So as I begin to array the kind of data that we have here, we have the ability to begin to look at this not only at the individual level and the provider level, but also at the condition level. And this is obviously important as we start to try to contemplate programs and different kinds of outreach strategies. We want to be able to understand, again, where do I actually want to be focusing my time, attention, and oftentimes very precious resource. And so one other tool that we've been able to apply to this is really a book of business benchmarks so that I can see payment year improvements or service year improvements year over year. So if in this graphic I'm looking at the darkest blue, that's 2015 service year, and if I look at the lighter blue, I see 2016 service year. So I can see some improvement in what's been happening here in terms of my coding capture and my revenue accuracy. But when I compare it to the book of business benchmark, I see a pretty big delta in a couple of areas. And so that tells me that I need to be spending a little bit more focus and attention on vascular disease, diabetes with chronic complications, major depressive bipolar situations, morbid obesity. These are keys to me to tell me that I don't necessarily have the right focus and attention potentially in those areas, and a program or additional support and outreach may be needed. So it gives me, again, more information to help construct a point of view on, and then also look to developing strategies and various tactics that can be deployed to try to change that situation and improve it for the following year. And we can also put that into the context then of just overall performance at the condition level. And this is just another way to compare data. It's just another way to begin to get a sense of where are these disparities and variations, and really begin to understand if I decide within that, how do I go get my focus, where do I want to put my resources. Again, doing some view of this from a benchmark perspective and calculating the potential value of working on these particular areas, you can quickly identify, again, just from a dollars and cents perspective, where the real need may be and whether or not I have the right tools to apply to that. But again, gives me additional information to say, for example, that my greatest opportunity based on this data and this comparison is really in addressing the major depressive, bipolar, and paranoid disorders. So looking at that as being a subset of the activities that I need to be paying attention to, and just perhaps doing some additional education and outreach with respect to.